So I think we can start the program. And I'm going to start it by turning it over to Debbie Dobbins, who is one of the co-chairs, along with Nicole Griffin of the Adult Programs Committee, so that she can introduce Scott.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining me. Can you hear me okay? Is it going okay? Okay, great. So Scott Ferson, in addition to being a First Church member, is a public relations executive and a Democratic Party strategist. As a young man, he began his political organizing career with John Anderson's presidential campaign in 1980. He went on to earn a master's degree from George Washington University in strategic public relations, and he served as press secretary for Senator Ted Kennedy, communications director for Congressman Stephen Lynch, and senior advisor during Congressman Seth Moulton's 2014 campaign. More recent activities have included being part of the communication teams for Senator Markey's re-election, general consultant and communications person for Speaker. And currently he's working with the DA, Marion Ryan, and Governor's Counselor Eileen Duff. His firm, the Liberty Square Group, is a strategic communications firm representing corporate, nonprofit, and through its political division, the Blue Lab political clients. If you'd like to learn more about him, you can find an entry on Wikipedia in the name of Scott Melbourne Ferson, and among other places. And Scott, feel free to say anything else about yourself you would like the group to know. Otherwise, take it away. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I appreciate that, and it's so great to see so many familiar faces that I haven't seen for a while, all maskless and everything. So that's great. I've got sort of 5 things that I want to talk about, and I'll pause after each one so we can get some reaction or questions for that. But we've all just been through sort of a very momentous couple of weeks. Incitement to impeachment to inauguration, back to impeachment, I think next week. All of the I's, we're working through the I's. So I thought, being old enough to remember this, I'd start with this story that's always struck me. That high over Kansas on August 9th, 1974 at noon, the pilot of Air Force One called down to the control tower and changed the call letters to SAM 28000, because at that precise moment, the President of the United States was no longer on the plane. He was in fact being sworn in at that moment, actually a few minutes before, in the East Room of the White House, Gerald Ford, the room that Richard Nixon had vacated less than 2 hours before. Watching that moment, as maybe a lot of us did, felt like a once-in-a-lifetime event. Gerald Ford at the time said, "Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule." And we've seen it play out unseemingly a couple of times in our lifetimes now, that they held, that these institutions that we have built with lots of checks and balances that are deeply, deeply flawed have held. And in fact, the things that maybe a year ago we would have said were wrong with the country and the Constitution and how it was holding real progress back for the country that we are today, may be the things that saved us in these past couple of months. I put that as a frame out. And I have these 2 observations. One is that there is an assault against democracy, who we are as a country. And it is an internal threat. And it's not just the insurrectionists that we see. It is young people who aren't so certain that democracy is working. It's people who are sort of what I would call backers of the table flippers. And we find them in both parties and outside those parties that want deep, deep, quick change in Washington, and sort of are backing those forces. These are people who aren't necessarily wedded to the forms of our democracy and our checks and balances. The other problem coupled with that, I think, at this time, and I'm going to spend more time talking about sort of the times we're in those 5 bullets, is an ethical challenge as it relates to this. Ethical people view politics differently, almost as if we would never in our lifetime, in our interactions on a daily basis, think that the ends justify the means. But in politics, a lot of people do. That the ends are so important that the means are less so. That we don't have to adhere to ethical boundaries that we do in our just in our regular life. I find that in the 40 years that I've worked in politics, growing, more pervasive, and more troubling to me. And it's not a problem on the right or on the left. It's a problem with people who have a feeling that the end justifies the means. And with the technology revolution and the communication revolution, it's a whole lot easier to use tools on varying platforms to be able to do that. And in fact, it's completely unchecked. So if I feel the end justifies the means, I can go around the norms of convention on my own platforms and communicate with people without any boundaries. And then when somebody does that, somebody on the other side feels that they must, or we're going to lose. And this is something that needs to be checked. And we're at a reckoning point, I think, at our time. Now, I know we had a very optimistic Wednesday. I don't mean to open up only with doom and gloom, but I want to frame it out that way. So the things that I want to talk about are, and I apologize, I sort of have notes, is, was 2020 the most important election of our lifetime? That's one. We hear that a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's the first one. The second one is that we are at the end of the 6 political party system in the United States. We have had 6 so far since the founding. They run about a generation. And because of circumstances, they change. This one started in 1968 and ran up through 2016. The Republican Party nominated somebody who's not a Republican in 2016. We, as Democrats, almost nominated somebody who wasn't a Democrat, Bernie Sanders, who's an actual socialist. The parties have ended in the construct they had in this last 6-party construct from 1968 on, and we're ready for a new one. The most important election, I think, will be 2024 of our lifetime moving forward. We'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the generational change demands and realignment, how, as we're working towards being a majority-minority country here in the United States, how that's affecting the way that parties are looking at, how young people coming into this, who are in a demographic that is majority-minority, voters 18 to 25, people 18 and younger are already majority-minority populations in the United States, and how that affects it, and how that's checking the electoral demographics that we've come to take for granted. Then I'll talk about 2 hopeful things moving towards 2024, which I think are the things that we should focus on as we're talking about what do we want either of the parties to be going to 2024. One is the barrier to the ballot is breaking down significantly, both to running and to access. And that's a very hopeful thing. And then the other thing is, I think specifically to Democrats, as I am one and deal in that and swim in that pond, is the importance of listening. Surveys that we have conducted will show you that independent voters in New Hampshire and other states don't feel welcome in the Democratic Party. They feel judged. They don't feel judged by individual Democrats. They feel judged by the party. Conversely, they feel judged by the Republican Party, but not by individual Republicans. And that's a problem for us going into 2024. So those are the 5 things that I'll talk about. I'll start with the first one. And it's weird that I'm looking at myself on the screen, but I will just talk to myself as I find it. Okay, so have we just seen the most important election of our lifetime? It's easy to think that. The existential threat that Donald Trump posed to the country makes it feel like the most important election of our lifetime. But I would ask you to sort of put that in context. Um, 1968 was a pretty important, and in fact, that's the last time we shifted in terms of the party structures. Republicans moving south, Democrats moving to urban areas. 1974 was pretty important. 1980, maybe 2008 was pretty important. In fact, I think now I'm starting to even think beyond the past 3 months that 2020 wasn't that important. It was important for removing a threat to the country. But it wasn't important in terms of the shift that's going to happen and that is going to come. So, much like 1974, with the removal of Richard Nixon, didn't ultimately change the dynamic of the party. It was removing a threat that existed and was exercised under the rules of the Constitution. And in fact, that's what happened here, that despite even a physical assault on the Capitol, the election worked. It seemed like it might not have, but in the end it did. But Joe Biden is not a transformative figure in the Democratic Party. Donald Trump, you might say, is a transformative figure in the Republican Party, but only if they don't repair themselves. I'd like to think of this, that in 2016, Donald Trump thought, well, it's very expensive to start a third party. Why don't I just take one of these two over? I'll just take one over. It's a whole lot easier to do it. They've got structures set up, they have things. I'll just go use my talents and take it over. And he basically took the Republican Party, tied them up, and put them in the basement. And that's where they have remained for 4 years. And now they are free, and they're coming out into the light, and they're blinking. They don't know what's happening, and it's disorienting for them. And Donald Trump is down at Mar-a-Lago. And so if they stick with them, then he was transformative for the Republican Party, and that's what the Republican Party is going to be. Joe Biden is a caretaker. I don't mean that pejoratively in this way, because I think he has room to be a transformational president, but he's not the transformational figure for the party moving forward for the next generation. He is 78 years old. Whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden were elected, they were likely to be one-term presidents, in that Donald Trump would have had to have been per the Constitution, and Joe Biden will be 82 years old 4 years from now. And God bless him and the immense work that he's going to have to do in 4 years. But putting on his shoulders the burden for another 4 years when he's 82 years old seems to me to be unreasonable. And also, I think the party, he was a person exactly for this time, as it turns out. He was exactly what we needed in this country, I think, moving forward. But in 2024, we're going to be looking forward to something. And with that, I'll pause there. So 2024, as I mentioned, marks the start of the seventh political party system in the United States. We flirt at these times with the notion that we should have a third party. In 1968, it was George Wallace, right? In the sense that the Democrats had abandoned the South, and that George Wallace was there for traditional Democrats. And they sort of toyed with Goldwater, trying to reform the Republican Party in '64, be that new leader. He turned out to be a dozen or so years too early for that. And then Wallace sort of presented that, sort of picking up what was left as the Democrats had moved in civil rights away from them. He was there for them. And there was that third party. But ultimately, they're not necessarily sustainable. I started, as was mentioned, my life in politics, working for John Anderson in 1980. I love John Anderson. All of us should be allowed to tilt at one windmill. That's the third party thing. So now there's a lot of discussion about, well, what should there be a third party? This feeds into what young people are feeling, that the two-party structure is too constrained for them, that they are actually looking for more options. They don't identify as Democrats or as Republicans, although they might belong to one of those parties. And frankly, the same way that I think maybe we do. If we were sort of asked, what are the important tenets of the Democratic Party? Maybe we wouldn't all have the same answers about that. So the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have become kind of shells of themselves, as they do every generation. And, since the demise of the Whigs and the rise of Abraham Lincoln, we've operated in the 160 years since then with these two monikers of Democrat and Republican. Yet they're very different parties than they were back then, obviously, and as they proceeded through 1860 to the Gilded Age, the New Deal to 1968, and 68 to today. And now we're here almost with kind of a clean slate, if you will, to think about what each party should look like. And I might say that people who consider themselves, one of the things I found fascinating about the people who they were interviewing who had stormed the Capitol is that a lot of those people said, oh, I voted for Obama. And here they are, and they've been radicalized in some way. And you sort of think, how is that possible? How do you get from voting for Obama to storming the Capitol and trying to assassinate the Speaker of the House and the Vice President of the United States? I don't, draw that line for me in some way. And so in some respects, we're kind of talking about appealing to those people. But if we don't have grounded parties who I can look at and say, Republicans believe in this, and Democrats believe in that in a positive way by themselves, not me saying what the Republican Party believes in or the Republicans saying what the Democrats believe in, but Republicans saying what they believe in and Democrats saying what they believe in under these new constructs. How are these people who vote for Obama and then vote for Trump, or vote for Obama and vote for Bernie Sanders and vote for Trump, going to know whether they should be affiliated with one party or not? And then you add to that this sense that people feel unwelcome, either by individual Republicans or by the Democratic Party as a whole. They feel judged about certain things that they believe in. Well, how are they going to know what to do? But we also historically can't handle more than two parties. We never have been able to. So John Anderson gets 9%, or Ross Perot gets a certain percent, or Ralph Nader gets a certain percent, but they're not sustainable and they don't fold themselves into the fabric. Even the Tea Party, or even Bernie Sanders as a socialist, who's now Chairman Sanders in the Democratic caucus, fold themselves into these two constructs of Democrats and Republicans. But it doesn't mean that there can't be a third party. It just means that the third party is going to be labeled Republican or Democrat. And the struggle is right now we kind of have three parties. We've got the Democrats and what we're going to be in 2024. We've got the Republicans and what they're going to be in 2024. And we've got Donald Trump, who is exactly who he is. And so those will form in some way, I think. And parts of them will break into two. The three will form into two. And Donald Trump will be the head of it, or Donald Trump will be on the outside. And the Democrats will coalesce around a certain ideology. And our battle is going to be over the progressive versus the moderate wing of the party, or I would argue it should be over sort of ideology versus economics. And I had a story at the end, but I'll say it now, that Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, a couple of years ago, I heard him talk, and I will never forget the story. He said, in my state, if you lose a job, the first thing to go is the dog, because dogs are expensive. And when you close the door behind the dog and then turn around and tell the kids that the dog ran away, that's what people in his state are facing. Democrats, we can have this battle of ideology, but I would argue we should have it over economics, because the Democratic message to that person in Ohio is, there's nothing there for you. You should move. Your job is gone. The fossil fuel industry is not coming back. And if I'm that person in Ohio, I will take a false promise over nothing every time. And if we do not, as Democrats, have a program that addresses that person, I don't care if you're poor in Ohio or poor in an inner city in Baltimore or a recent refugee who's trying to struggle, the struggle's the same. And we tend to focus on certain populations and not others. Yet if you've got a false promise, you can say it to everybody. And Donald Trump said that to everybody. And in fact, he almost won. And he won Ohio twice. I will say this two. One thing about rule following, because it sort of fits in here. Americans, and again, I understand the irony of people storming the Capitol and not following the rules. So I say this with understanding that I don't mean it in that way. We follow rules in politics, determined norms. We understand the two parties and we can accept that. When Al Gore lost in 2000, won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College, I would have thought there would be an uprising in this country. That people would have said, what? What's the Electoral College? What do you mean? I voted and the guy who won is not president? And we didn't. Despite the Florida thing, it wasn't even the Florida thing. I mean, won by 500,000 votes. It wasn't even about Florida. If we were concerned about the popular vote, but there was no revolt, none, and none in 2016 either, none. We are rule followers, and so they broke into the Capitol and then stayed within the velvet ropes going through the rotunda. There's a certain way we kind of think about these things, and the difference between Democrats and Republicans right now is that Democrats question the rules. Why do we have an electoral college? Republicans don't question the rules. They're happy to use they're the ones that are storming the gates, if you will. That's the way they do it. But they follow the rules that are set up. And it's not probably surprising, since the rules were set up by the founding fathers to ensure there wasn't a lot of this agitation in the political system where people were questioning the rules. They set the whole construct up so that people didn't question the rules. So when you do, you lose. And in fact, not only in 2000 and 2016, but anytime a president has lost the popular vote, but been elected elected president by the Electoral College, it's been a Republican. So Andrew Jackson and Rutherford B. Hayes, when Rutherford B. Hayes run, and Tilden, and Gore and Clinton, they were all Democrats. The rules institutionally are set up for people who are for the party who would, quote, follow the rules, even if they're sort of just constructs. So with that, I'll stop. I'll pause there.
We have a few questions here about the first section, really about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and really the leadership of the party. One question was, who will replace Joe in 2024? Your speculation, of course. And then this is a question specifically, do you equate Kamala Harris with Biden in terms of being transformative or not for 2024? And has she been a national figure long enough to tell?
Great question. So, we elect outsiders. That's who we like. I mean, Joe Biden is sort of the exception that proves the rule in this way, which is why I think you have to look at 2020 kind of as it's sitting on its own bottom, if you will. That this was all about Donald Trump. Donald Trump was the outsider, and voters who voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump did it because they liked that. They don't want somebody who, I've supported John Anderson, Walter Mondale, Dick Gephardt, Joe Biden in the past, not this election. And I do it because I kind of look at this and I think I would like the person who's the most qualified to be president, who I think is the most qualified to be president, and can be a leader. And they're all losers, right? None of them, Hillary Clinton. So all didn't win, the people that I supported. And who do we support? I'm a big supporter of Barack Obama, but I didn't support him in the primary. I didn't think he was the most qualified. I've supported Hillary Clinton. So, but they don't win. So in the country, we like the Trumps, the Obamas, Bill Clinton, outsiders, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan was an outsider. John Kennedy, to a certain extent, was an outsider. Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton University a year and a half before he was elected president. We have a history of electing outsiders. So you have to kind of separate out who the front runner is to be the Democratic nominee in 2024, it might be somebody we don't even know or is on our radar screen. You have to put Kamala Harris in the #1 slot if you were putting these things out now, and we'll spend all of our time deciding who's going to be the next president in 2024 and the nominee. But set that aside and then talk about the parties as well. I think there's two things going on here because they're disconnected. It's not as if we would spend some time in the next 2 years figuring out what the Democratic Party believes in, and then naturally from that would come a nominee. That's not the way we do it in this country. We have the process that's going to elect a person who sort of meets that moment. Trump met that moment, Obama met that moment, Clinton met that moment. That's who we elect president. Yeah, so, would we be better off with a parliamentary system in our country? Perhaps, right? But we can't, it's just, we can't even get a third party, let alone try to get to that point. So I just don't think that we're, that, first of all, the parties, and this was Donald Trump's part of his genius in the way he did it. I mean, I hope we don't find somebody so ungrounded in ethical reality that they would say, "Oh, I don't know if I'm a Republican, but I'll be a Republican. I'll do that. I'll be for this. I'll be for that. I'll be for whatever." All in the march to just be all about me. Let's hope there's not somebody else like that. But he was smart to go in and say, "Well, they've got it all set up. They run the process. They have the mechanics. They've got the access to money. They've got everything set up." Which is why I say that they will stay. The shells will kind of stay. And then they'll be populated by new thinking. So that'll be fascinating to watch. I'm not sure what the strategy is for the speaker to send over the impeachment article on Monday, which would start a trial on Tuesday. I kind of like this notion that they would let it play out for a couple of weeks, mainly to gather information from the FBI about who might have incited it and whether there's anybody in 1600 Pennsylvania who might be tagged with that, which would make the case stronger. You can see he's so volatile that you could say for Democrats, it would make sense to get him out of the game. Well, if that's it for Democrats, then you can imagine Republicans would say, well, maybe we want him in the game. Maybe we don't want him out of the game if he's that concerning to Democrats because he's such a wild card. Because logically, it would make sense that for Mitch McConnell and others, well, not Mitch McConnell, but for people in his caucus who think of themselves as president of the United States, that they would want him out of the game. So I think you need some of them because you can run through pretty quickly the number of people who are just so horrified by his action, Republicans who are so horrified by his action that they would vote. And let's say that number's 5 or 6. Let's be optimistic and say it's 7. We're still 10 votes away. So there has to be a political calculus to it. And the political calculus for Mitch McConnell is going to be not what happens 4 years from now for Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz or whoever else might be, Marco Rubio might be running for president, but what happens, how does he get his gavel back in 2 years? So his whole construct is going to be what senators are up, what would impeachment mean for them, what would impeachment mean for Democrats in purple states that are going to be up. I think there may be more Republicans up in 2 years than Democrats. I hadn't looked at it in a while. The whole it's horrible to say that the whole impeachment strategy is going to be who's going to control the Senate in 2 years. But I think because McConnell's going to control those Republican votes. And if he votes for impeachment and indicates, then maybe they will. My sense is they don't seem to be courting him, because they would have acceded to his wish to hold it off for a couple of weeks, which is really immaterial. And we could pass maybe, get the cabinet appointments in and everything else. There's reasons for Democrats to want to put it off for a couple of weeks, but they're not. So my sense is they don't feel that McConnell wants to play, and so they're just going to run it through, shove it down the Republicans' throats, and get as many Republican votes as they can. That's my guess.
Scott, I think they have agreed that the trial doesn't start until February 8th. That's what was reported early this evening. So I'm not sure that just because they're sending over the articles of impeachment that they, unless, if they agree that they don't have to start the trial, that they can delay that. So
The rule was that they start the next. I had not heard that. That's good. The rule, yeah. So if they've done that, that's great. Of course, they can change whatever rule they. Great. So as I said, generational change demands a realignment. It just does. Since '68, we've talked about this. There's always kind of been a revolution, if you will. There's been a reason for the change. So it's not just that people sit around and say, "Oh, we've done this for 35 years. Why don't we reorganize ourselves?" It's been, it was the Great Depression. It was the Gilded Age in the way that we just employed human capital in terms of means of production. It was the Civil War. It was the expansion of the United States in 1828. So those things have happened. But we have had a revolution. The revolution is the technology revolution. In Back to the Future, the revolution, when you look to, which I think was Back to the Future was what, 10 years ago or something now, but it was all, the skateboard that, floated, and the revamped DeLorean that could fly. And that's the way we thought in the 80s about what the revolution would be. And the revolution wasn't that at all. And when we think about it, if we were able to sort of channel a loved relative who has died from 30 years ago and say, I hold all of the information in the world, now my light's on this phone, everything that's ever been known, would be absurd to it. And yet we've had this revolution, and it's invited in a lot of participants who are non-traditional in terms of the party structure. Traditionally, 5% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans, these are registered Republicans and registered Democrats, decide who the nominee is of the party. 5%. And then we sort of throw them out, and then we hope that as many people as possible kind of participate and vote in the process. But they're determined by 5%. But the voices now are multitudes and amplified. On the Markey campaign, students from Markey were a huge force. None of them registered to vote. I'm broad brushing here. I think I'm right, because they weren't old enough. None of them were 18. So they couldn't, and yet they were a huge influence and a huge voice. So political parties historically shift with demographic changes, growth of cities, expansion west. We're 25 years away from being a majority-minority country. A number of states already are. Arizona, a majority-minority state, is also one of the youngest states. Georgia is a young state. Iowa and Massachusetts are older and whiter and represent the dynamics of the six-party system, if you will. Of the 21 states with the slowest growth in the country, 21 slowest growing states, all of them are solid D or solid R. None of them are swing states. The states that aren't growing are stuck in place. That includes Massachusetts. It includes Iowa. It includes states like that. There's not enough of a dynamic shift to change things. Young voters, as I mentioned, aren't such big believers in democracy. They were big voters this time. They aren't historically big voters. And it jumped 10%, at least in the last election, to about 55% participation of registered voters between 18 and 25, which is a really hopeful sign, but also very volatile, because, as I say, they're not big believers in democracy. Senator Markey's reelection campaign produced, if you haven't seen it, the Sunrise Movement ad had Senator Markey asking, with all due respect, what has your country done for you? That Senator Markey won by a fairly significant margin in Massachusetts against Joe Kennedy, in large by motivating young voters with that message. What has the country done for you? And I remember watching that ad thinking, on the Markey campaign, and thinking, he's not wrong. For that generation, it's different than my generation, which was born in the era of Kennedy saying, ask not what your country can do for you. They're in a very, very different place. than we are. And there are a lot of Trump supporters who don't believe in democracy as well, in addition to the ones who stormed the gate, the ones who helped them: Graham, Cruz, Hawley, Gates, Jordan, Gozar, all these people, the people who carry guns onto the floor of the House of Representatives. And then there are these shifts, right? Biden won Arizona and Georgia, but Trump won Ohio and Florida twice. Trump made gains among African-American males and Latinx voters in South Florida and on the border counties of Texas, which is counterintuitive. Given his stance on immigration, you would wonder how Latinx voters could vote for him, but they did. We have to look at that and find out why. So the battle over the Democratic Party, as I say, will be this ideological thing, sort of the Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey, Bernie Sanders wing of the party with kind of the Joe Biden wing of the party. That's the way it's. I'm hoping to change that dynamic and talk about it in the way that in economics as we did. The Republicans have, I think, a more complicated and a more simple problem. It could be the party of the Trump cult, in which case it'll be like Kim Jong-il giving it to Kim Jong-un, and Don Jr. will take the mantle of the party and they'll move along in that way. Or it could remake itself. And this, I think, is a bigger problem. Senator Rubio is already reaching out to engage Latinx voters across the country. Republicans are countering sort of the Trump false promises with economic appeal to marginalized communities. They may actually do it in a substantive way, in a way that they feel that people in marginalized communities may look at the Democratic Party and think it looks a lot like me, somebody sitting here living in Belmont, and it's not going to resonate with them in that way. I think Joe Biden has done a nice job in his messaging of trying to reach out to everybody and talking about an economic message, but we have to do that. So. But we have to remember this as Democrats, as we're trying to think about what we're going to be and what the success is for 2024. Democrats have won 7 of the last 8 presidential elections by the popular vote. 7 of the last 8. The last popular vote we lost was in 2004. Before that, it was 1988. Two Massachusetts candidates, I might point out. Both losers in 1988 and 2004. The last 2 times a Democrat has lost the popular vote. The Democrats in the last 4 elections have gotten 26 million more votes than the Republican candidates in the last 4 elections. We don't have a voter problem. We have an electoral problem. And we have to deal with that. As I mentioned, 21 states that have had the smallest growth are all solid blue or red. The first swing state appears at number 28, Iowa. Iowa is the 28th slowest growing state, and it's the first swing state. And it's not really that swing. But the demographic shifts are there. So in 1984, the percentage of the vote that was white voters was 85%. 85% of the total vote in 1984 was white. In 2081, in 08, 77, in 2016, 73. And this last year, it was 69%. The white vote is 69%. Why is this important as it relates to the electoral construct? Well, to be elected as a Republican, you have to get more than 50% of the white vote. You do not need to get more than 50% of the white vote if you're a Democrat. And in fact, they haven't. So Reagan won his 2 elections with 56 and 66% of the white vote. Bush, the first Bush, 60% of the white vote. Second Bush, 55 and 58% of the white vote. And Trump, 54 and 56% of the white vote. 54% of the white vote, lost with 56% of the white vote. Donald Trump got 56% of the white vote and lost this election, won with 54% of the white vote. And so we're just at that tipping point in the Electoral College, which is why it was so precarious on election night and for the couple of days after that. And frankly, he engineered his own defeat by telling people not to vote early, in retrospect, because then people did. Apparently, when you make it easier for people to vote, they actually vote. So it's great. And Democrats voted early in overwhelming numbers. So he didn't need, and it pumped up the Latinx and the African-American vote and the white vote in the suburbs that Trump needed that he didn't get. Carter won the presidency with 48% of the white vote. Clinton, 39% of the white vote and 44% of the white vote. Obama, 43% of the white vote and 39% of the white vote. Obama won his second election with 39% of the white vote. And Biden won this election by the most votes ever cast for any president ever, with 42% of the white vote. So the white vote is coming down. Donald Trump, despite his best efforts, couldn't make white people have more kids. He just couldn't figure that out. And so white people are dying at a faster rate than they're being born. African-American population is staying steady. Asian population is growing slightly and steadily. And the Latinx population is growing exponentially, not only by immigration, but in the native population in states. It's the only one that's growing significantly, except in Utah, where the white population is growing in other states. And I will pause there. And then the next two are the positive ones, but I'll pause there with observations.
Okay. Alice, do you want to ask that question yourself?
Okay. I couldn't exactly, I typed this over and over again, and I couldn't exactly get it phrased in a very understandable way, but I was listening very carefully to what you were saying about growth and demographic changes in some of the states, whereas Massachusetts is rather unchanging. So what I'm thinking about are things like voter suppression and gerrymandering in states like North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, whatever, and how in states that are changing, those elements will factor in the future.
Yeah, and you're previewing my fourth point in terms of the breaking down of the barriers to entry, because I almost think if the barriers to the Capitol were breached, the barriers to the ballot box were breached in a lot of places in this past election, and we tend to focus on, frankly, it kind of exposed all the voter suppression efforts that are going on, legal and otherwise, in this race. So you're right. And frankly, there's a ton of voter suppression in Massachusetts. Massachusetts doesn't do a great job at all about having access to the ballot. And, and even we should. States are way ahead of us. Some states let you vote by email. Indiana lets you vote, and we don't do any of these things. Set aside all of the fear mongering that went on about ballot access. What we proved in this last election is that when presented with, setting Donald Trump aside, when presented with a global pandemic that challenged the very way that we would actually physically vote, states, red states, blue states, were able to figure it out. And the systems are in place and held. I don't hold up the Secretary of State in Georgia as a particular hero in this, because I'm not sure, for me, he's a very palatable politician. But the systems were in place to be able to hold. And Stacey Abrams is one of the examples I'll have. And when Stacey Abrams showed is that you can put up as many barriers as possible, and we will figure out how to get over them if you've got the right effort to be able to do so. I would argue this, though, in terms of barriers to the ballot box. Anybody who's in power doesn't want to encourage anybody else to be in power. I don't care whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. Part of the objection to mail-in balloting in Massachusetts was this notion that, well, if we let a ton of people who've never voted before vote, what will they do? It turns out in Massachusetts, in the legislative races, they do what the rest of us who vote do. And in fact, I would say this one thing too, that I think I call the mail-in ballot the Google ballot. You get your ballot, you open it up, Governor's Council. What's a Governor's Council? Governor's Council. Oh, Eileen Duff is my governor's counselor. What did she do? Oh, she's an LGBTQ candidate. Oh, she's great. I'm going to vote for her. But if we had walked into, I say that because Eileen Duff, is a client of mine at the Governor's Council for the North Shore. And normally we would go in, and if we saw her name and we didn't recognize it, we wouldn't vote. I don't know what a governance council is. I don't know who Eileen Duff is. I don't know who might be challenging her. But with the Google ballot, we were able to sit and sort of figure out who these people were and take our time. Isn't that nice and refreshing?
Yep. Okay, any other questions before we move on? No, I don't see any. So take it away, Scott.
Sure. So in a positive forward-looking, what Alice was just saying, in a forward-looking way, the barriers to the ballot are breaking down. And you know, I loved watching Kamala Harris being sworn in. And then you remember that there have been, 96 people elected president and vice president of the United States, and there's one woman. Of the 12,000 or so individuals who've been elected to serve in Congress, 250 have been women in the history of the United States. More than 100 of them are serving right now. So 250 isn't much in 12,000. And in fact, that 105 of them or so are serving right now, 100 years after women got the right to vote, is not something I think we should be patting ourselves on the back. And in fact, we're not very diverse, even when you look at other things. Joe Biden is the second Catholic president ever elected president of the United States. But the hold on power, as I mentioned, is bipartisan. Once you're in, you don't want to encourage others in. I was Seth Moulton's general consultant in 2014. We challenged an incumbent Democrat who we beat in a primary. Nobody was happy with me. Nobody was happy with him, certainly. Nobody was happy with any of us in the Democratic Party, and he wasn't. 3 degrees from Harvard, 4 tours of duty in Iraq, 2 Bronze Stars. But we're upset at him for challenging the status quo in that way. Now Seth Moulton is a congressman. I don't want anybody to run against Seth Moulton. So the whole construct is set up not to want anybody to challenge in that way. So we have to fight against that. I say this, I don't know whether people like me saying this or not, but Democrats hate Citizens United. It's that rallying cry. It always gets a cheer, right? And we have to repeal Citizens United. Well, I would argue this, right? If marriage equality is settled law, why isn't Citizens United? The Supreme Court has said it's speech. We can fight against it and cheer at the rallies every time somebody says it. But the reality is, Democrats don't hate money. We just hate their money. We like our money. Republicans like their money, they hate our money. There's more money spent every cycle. Every cycle. No one's discouraging spending money. No one is. So you have to do something else. We can fight to repeal Citizens United. I'm all for that. Or we can say, if we can't do that, what's the problem? How do we get around that, the money in politics? That's why I started the Blue Lab 7 years ago, which was to encourage first-time candidates to run for office. And what we do is we do 2 things. We train college students on how to run campaigns by professionals. They do it for credit at their colleges. And for that, I'm able to give candidates bandwidth, which is basically what you would spend the money on. Spending money on TV is not the same anymore. It can waste it. We waste tons of money on campaigns. We still raise it and waste almost most of it. But you still need people to work on campaigns and do it. So I can offer first-time candidates, primarily women and people of color, first-time candidates, endless bandwidth to run their campaigns. And we've had great success doing that. Rachel Rollins for DA, Marion Ryan in her first race, Liz Miranda in Boston, Trum Wynn up in Andover, and lots of people that now we've had like dozens and dozens of candidates, and it's a great equalizer. So money is less effective now anyway. Certainly, I'm talking about the local levels or not. Obviously, when you get to Senate and presidential level, money is a very different thing in terms of the way you need to battle that out with Republicans. But at the local level, you can really be an equalizer on doing that. Cindy Friedman came in to talk with the Blue Lab. In the Blue Lab, the students decide which races they want to work on. So the candidates have to come in and pitch. And when Cindy Friedman came in and pitched, we were all in for the Blue Lab. And they made some ridiculous number, thousands and thousands and thousands of phone calls for her in a short election. And she cited it as one of the differences in her race. Free, essentially. Because for first-time candidates, we talk about, it goes back to this 12,250, trying to find, quote, qualified candidates for non-traditional candidates for higher office are hard to find. It's a tough business. Well, these are the feeders. If you don't start here for select board, city council, mayor, state representative, state senator, you're not going to have those feeders up. And I think we see the fruits start to bear out in the field for the mayor of City Boston. There are tons of really interesting candidates, non-traditional candidates who are going to be looking at that race and running for office. So that's important. And then the other one is, and I'm probably not as familiar with the whole tactics of how Stacey Abrams put her program together in Georgia, as a lot of people who might be on this call. But I am shocked that David Perdue lost. Senator Warnock is a great candidate. I didn't think Senator Ossoff was a great candidate. And just looking at the dynamic in Georgia, if he's not thanking Stacey Abrams for being elected United States Senator every day, he should, because I think that's the difference. And they took everything that was thrown against them in Georgia, and she was able to just figure out how to reach out to people, get them to the voting booth, despite all of the barriers. Up in the Markey campaign, I saw it a little bit on what John Walsh, who is now Senator Markey's chief of staff and was his campaign manager and the former chair of the party, as relational organizing. And it's this way that you're able to not just throw a bunch of stuff at you. There's certainly a lot of that in Georgia and everywhere else, where I'm just bombarded with information. But it was that relational organizing that worked in Georgia. And I think we should make Stacey Abrams whatever Stacey Abrams wants to be. I think we should just let her run the entire thing going into 2022 and 2024 and have her figure out how we do that in South Carolina and North Dakota and Wyoming and everywhere else, because that's where we should be. And that helps solve our electoral college problem. And I'll pause there. I think the odds of overturning the electoral college are almost next to nothing, in terms of even beyond. It's so obscure. As I say, we're sort of wedded to these norms. In 2016, nobody sort of raised objection. I don't mean people on this call. I mean the country kind of raised an objection to call for its repeal at that time. The states that are entering into these compacts tend to be blue states that are voting together anyway. And unless if we saw states that traditionally vote Republican, these 21 that I'm talking about, band together to do the same thing, I would be concerned that they feel that somehow the electoral college strategy has been flipped and Republicans are going to lose based on that, and they had figured out the other strategy of how to win the popular vote. I personally would like to see one thing. One of us is to actually look at the electoral map as Democrats and sort of say, we had a blue lab effort and a welcoming party strategy down in South Carolina. Why have we not been investing in South Carolina in this relational way for a long time? Democrats have sort of left states where we've felt that we couldn't get them. And in fact, since the efforts are run largely out of DC, from DC, they don't have a feel for what it's like. They want everybody to be cookie cutter, have the same messages, do the same ads, and not without realizing that Massachusetts is different from South Carolina and Wyoming. And where Democrats have won in those congressional races 2 years ago in Oklahoma and South Carolina and other places, it's been when we've had a Democrat who actually reflects that district. But I had a friend running in the Texas 17th district, no support whatsoever, great candidate. Pete Sessions is now the Republican congressman. He moved into the district and won. If there had been Democratic support in the Texas 17th, we might have been able to flip more seats in certain states like that if we concentrated on it. We should have a 50-state program, and we don't. I once was talking to somebody at the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and I said, well, you look at the Democratic at the 17th in Texas, and he said, no. He said, he hasn't demonstrated they can raise money. He said, we're not a hedge fund. And my response to that is, that's exactly what you should be. We should be a hedge fund. We should be hedging our bets everywhere in all of these states. We should be listening, which gets to my fifth point. We should be listening to what people are saying, voters are saying in these states that we're ignoring. And it leads to this policy issue where we're saying to that voter in Ohio, there's nothing here for you. We might not be saying that, that's what he's hearing. And that's a problem. And in fact, I think we aren't kind of listening to them, because just even in the language we use, not to go off on a tangent, just a little one, is we say, well, you've lost your job, but we'll retrain you. Think about that if somebody said that to us. We'll retrain you. It's a very condescending thing to say. No one would say that to us, I don't think. I have had my company for 20 years. It's a very different company than it was 20 years ago. But if somebody said, Scott, you have to figure out how to use these devices and stuff to do your job 20 years ago, I would say, I have no idea what you're talking about. But we learn and we adapt. And if we say to this person who's out of work in Ohio, well, it seems like you need a job. Let's just get you a job. And actually had a sitting member of Congress tell me, well, we're trying that. I don't know how we do that. That's hard to do. And my answer back to that is, well, Franklin Roosevelt figured it out. You know, as we're reinventing ourselves, there are some things that we can point to that transformed this country. And one of them is actually listening to those voters that we're not talking to and we're not engaging with.
So we have a lot of questions in the chat. I guess I'll just read them. Is Blue Lab still working in the South? Should be a simple one for you.
It is. It's in. We have this dynamic young woman who's running the Blue Lab in South Carolina. We had also opened up one. We have one in New Hampshire, and we helped a number of House candidates there. And we opened up one in Wisconsin because we were following the primaries, and then we got shut down by COVID. But the one in South Carolina is up and running. And if you know young people in college who want to be part of the Blue Lab, it is now virtual and it's online, and the application is, and we do it by semester. They do it for credit. It has Peter Rubitasio, who's the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Stonehill College, is the academic advisor to it. We take about 30 to 40 students, depending on it, on a semester. It's run by Casey Atkins, Congressman Chet Atkins' daughter, and they do an incredible program. And they run campaigns. And I meet graduates all the time who are on campaigns and other jobs. One who's the communications director for the state party in Illinois, and somebody who works in fundraising in California. It's a great program.
Good. Here's another question. Are the new census results likely to help states' legislatures flip blue?
So the flip part, I don't think so, because the population centers that are coming up, well, some of them are purple, so it could be, but you're going to have states like Rhode Island potentially lose an electoral vote, lose a congressional seat, and go to one. So the older states that are blue, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, those states could lose some, but also Republican states could. And then you've got states that are solidly blue that'll pick up, like California and others. Then you've got states that it could play, like Texas, for instance, and others. That's why having control of the legislatures in those states was important and a priority. And we didn't get many wins in those. The question, I think, will be whether the census results are even certified in enough time to be able to handle the redistricting in 2022 for those races. I will say this, though, and this goes back to demographic changes and changes in the Electoral College. For the youth vote, 18 to 25-year-olds, to change one state from red to blue, it would have to increase, voter participation would have to increase by 35% from 2016. So the youth vote would have to increase by 35% to flip one red state from 2016 blue, and that was Michigan. The reason why Joe Biden concentrated on white working class voters is if he increased his participation in the white vote by 2%, he flipped 5 states. So that's the distribution problem that we have when we're talking about the census moving forward.
Um,
So I did some work in Puerto Rico too. And I think maybe it's because I'm a comms person. This is a messaging thing, right? How can, Puerto Rico exists under a colonial construct. How is that allowed? And in fact, in a time after 9/11, how are we allowing Puerto Rico to kind of hang out there in this colonial construct without either being part of the United States or its own independent island? And I think it's the way you frame it. In fact, I might be cynical and say that politicians, Republicans and Democrats, raise a ton of money in Puerto Rico, and maybe they like this conflict over the status, but that's a whole other discussion. But if you take away the current status in the referendum in Puerto Rico, which is equally divided, not recently, but had been equally divided, and you just say you have to be independent or you have to be part of the United States, they overwhelmingly vote to be part of the United States. Now, we don't have to wait, Congress doesn't have to wait for Puerto Rico to make that indication, but we have to figure out a way to frame it so that Congress would see the urgency of needing to do that. And right now, the winner of, well, you can't have so many Democrats elected in DC and Puerto Rico is winning the day from a messaging standpoint.
So we have more questions, but I think it would be good for you to do your final segment, and then we can see if we can pick up some of these questions that are in the chat.
Sure. And I'll be just really quick about it because I think I've woven it in, which is the important part of listening. So we did this welcome party tour, and we did it in New Hampshire and South Carolina, and we're going to do it in Wisconsin. And it was to welcome people into the Democratic Party who didn't feel comfortable. And so we did a lot of polling, and that's where we got the number that said that people didn't feel welcome in the Democratic Party. They felt judged. And then we did a roundtable. I'll end with this. We did a roundtable in Manchester, New Hampshire, with Democratic activists to basically say, why do you, when you're having conversations with people, why do you think people don't feel welcome in the Democratic Party? And I'll never forget one person saying, well, if somebody isn't pro-choice, I'm totally pro-choice. But I mean, if somebody wasn't pro-choice, I think it would be hard to have a conversation with them. And, we see people all the time about, who might own a gun. And I'm totally for gun control. I'm totally for gun control. But, it's hard to talk to somebody like that. And I was sitting there thinking, watching this person thinking, I think you own a gun, but you don't want to tell me that. And you feel like you can't say that in this group because that would be bad. Now, maybe that person didn't, maybe that person wasn't pro-life. But the fact that even as a Democrat, you probably find this in your conversations where you'll say, well, people who pick a latest, choice or something. Say, we find ourselves trying to apologize for ourselves. Well, I'm totally pro-choice. That's a problem. If we're trying to get people to join us in an effort, and they feel so sensitive about some of those things. Obviously, these things are stark. But maybe somebody thinks Donald Trump's stance on China was right. Maybe somebody thinks his moving the embassy to Jerusalem was correct. Maybe there are so many minefields, just generally, that we set out, that as people are we're approaching them as a conversation. We have to, if we're going to increase our numbers and our strength, we have to listen to them and find out what they're saying. And Diane Hesson, who is on the editorial board of the Globe and has written her piece, followed 200 Trump Republicans and 200 Clinton voters for 5 years. And she's just kind of concluded that effort. And she listened. And it's qualitative kind of polling that I love. And I remember she was telling me she had this conversation with a voter in Alabama who was voting for the guy who was running against Doug Jones, whose name I try to keep out of my mind. And she said, how can you vote for him? This is before Tuberville, when Jones won. And he said, well, you vote for Al Franken? And she said, well, yeah, but it would. He said, okay, I'm a Republican. I will vote for, I understand the charges against him, but I'm a Republican. And we can't understand that on a certain level. But in that way, in engaging in that conversation, and he knew she was a Democrat, but then was saying, this is the way I'm kind of looking at what you're doing. And this is the way I'm not looking at it in that way. And I think we have to unlock that. And frankly, I think we should spend the next 2 years as a party in an effort to try to just go listen to people and find out where they live and the way that they're talking about things. And then we're going to be better able to, frankly, craft policies that are going to address their needs. Because there was something in Obama that they voted for, that somebody might have voted for, that they found in Trump. And if it's that promise of what's going to happen, even though what Obama was promising was real and what Trump was promising was not, is still that promise. And we have to find out what people are looking for in 2024 in these terribly, terribly unsettling times.
Well, would you like some more questions, Scott? Because we do have a few.
Sure.
Okay, we're coming to the end. I mean, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to call on, there are several people in the chat here. I think it would be good to hear your voices. So Alice, how about that question about Jamie Harrison?
Just wondering what you thought or how you thought Jamie Harrison might shake up the DNC.
I hope he does. So my hope would be that he abolishes it. That would be, we could start there. I think of the DNC in the same way that I think of kind of fraternity clubs and others, where the people who are in it love to be in it. And it almost, there should be term limits. I don't think there should be term limits for people who run for office, but I think there should be term limits for people in the DNC and all of these groups, where you're constantly needing new voices and fresh blood. And Tom Perez and I both worked for Senator Kennedy, and I have great admiration for him. I didn't think he was a great pick for the party. And I got to see Jamie Harrison in South Carolina when I was down there. And for a number of reasons. One is African-American women are the backbone of the Democratic Party. So having somebody not only sitting in the vice presidency seat, but somebody at the head of the party is a good message. And we lost some ground with African-American men to Donald Trump. So there's an appeal there. And he's from the South, and determinedly from the South. So my concern is that he's going to get in there, and it's such a bureaucracy that, it's almost overwhelming, I think, once you get in there. And it's the care and feeding of the DNC members and whatnot. Nothing against DNC members, but just the care and feeding of that takes up an enormous amount of time. And I'm hoping he can break out of that.
James, you want to ask that question about Jim Clyburn?
Yeah, I heard an interview with Jim Clyburn shortly after that the defund the police moniker, he thought, cost some congressional seats. So I was wondering if there's any way to instill any kind of message discipline with our activists, our frontline people.
No, there isn't. And I would say that's a good thing in a democracy, right? Everyone gets a voice. But what we have to do is have a voice that, I want to find some time and do a study on the whole origin of the phrase defund the police, because it's not the policy, right? So, but where it came into the mainstream, and the media is complicit in this because they're looking for ways to be controversial, but having a strong counter that is actually a correct understanding of what policies put forward might be. I will say this about Jim Clyburn too, since I saw him in South Carolina. When I got down there, Joe Biden was not going to win the South Carolina primary. It might have been Tom, the business guy, who I think is a fraud, him and or somebody else, and they were spending tons of money, and nobody in South Carolina was paying it. No, I can't say people were paying attention. People had their lives in South Carolina. So when I went out to dinner one night, I was talking with the server, and she said, "Oh yeah, is that Saturday? You know, the caucuses?" Like they weren't thinking about it in the same way that New Hampshire or Iowa did. And then Jim Kleinberg endorsed Joe Biden, and it was over. Every conversation I had after that was, well, I don't know, but Jim Kleinberg's with Joe Biden, and I trust him. And it was just over. And so he should also, in addition to Stacey Abrams, get whatever he wants in this race.
Can I do a quick follow-up? And that is, maybe it's in the DNC and Jamie Harrison can find it. Is there any kind of committee that sits around with smart people coming up with catchy phrases? Because it seems like the Republicans always get the snazzier phrases that catch people's attention.
Yeah, I'm sure there are both inside the party structure and outside. I think the problem is they're all in Washington. And again, going back to Seth Moulton, when he won the primary, he was then the party nominee, and all of the the keys to the offices, all of the opposition research on his Republican opponent, everything came to Seth Moulton. In addition, that all the ads he ran for the money he got from Washington had to say certain things. Well, no one had been up in the district to know how you should message a candidate for Congress up in Salem in the North Shore. So you get people who are deciding what the message is in Washington. Well, how do we expect that to work even here? So that's the problem. Yeah, there's tons of people and they're making enormous amounts of money. We're all in the wrong business. We should be doing that, just coming up with messaging for Democrats. So I guess let me think about it. Let me talk about it this way, right? If I had to pick a popular candidate or one who had the best organization, definitely pick the best organization. Particularly as people were becoming more sophisticated in the way that people get to the polls and vote, and more communications platforms to be able to communicate with voters in that way. I would take that. Your point is really well taken, particularly at certain levels. I mean, I think every race is different, right, at every level. So what do I want in a state representative is very different than what I want in a United States senator or president of the United States. I might want, and I think I have, somebody who, if I picked up the phone and asked him to help, would get back to me and be helpful in that way. They're also not. I'm not necessarily looking at a person in that way. Voters are funny in this way. I'll tell you this story. When I worked for Tim Murray, running in 2006 for lieutenant governor, it was 3 candidates for governor: Deval Patrick, Chris Gabrielli, and Tom Riley, and 3 candidates for lieutenant governor, including Tim Murray, who was the mayor of Worcester. And we did a poll. Mitt Romney was governor, and we asked, "What do you want in a governor? What do you want in a lieutenant governor?" And what people wanted in a governor was somebody who was not a typical background for politics, somebody who hadn't done it before, somebody who was a visionary. Deval Patrick, in that respect. What do you want in a lieutenant governor? Somebody with experience, somebody who knows how to do the job. And I'm looking at this poll and I'm thinking, this is absurd. How do you want a governor who doesn't have experience and a lieutenant governor who does have experience? And the pollster said, we have to understand this. Nobody knows what a lieutenant governor is. So your answer to the question is, well, somebody who can do the job, whatever that job might be, so it becomes, you've got one ad and you sort of try to pick it up. And so then it's kind of like, it's these races where it's sort of like, well, I guess I'll vote for that person, or I like that person. And in Massachusetts, for instance, I think going into 2022, this is not popular in this way, in that whatever show you sang that song from, but it's sort of like, I think people are going to be not necessarily looking for white men to vote for in statewide, that the tide is kind of turning in a whole lot of races. I said before Marty Walsh got picked for the cabinet that Marty Walsh would be the last white male mayor of Boston. Whether he got reelected or not, he might get reelected, but he was going to be the last one. And I think I'm going to be right in that. So I would say popular almost was that kind of that old construct of you know, the guy you wanted to have a beer with. And I'm hoping that popular is taking on a new meaning in terms of what I might actually be looking for in my elected official, and then slotting that person who looks like that into it. I think that might be an optimistic way to look at popular. Not my area of expertise, the fairness doctrine, but I will say this just as an observation. I was talking with Matt Visor, who at that time I think was still with the Boston Globe, and in 2015. And I said, how do you cover Donald Trump? This may even be a little bit before that when he was thinking about it. I said, when he says something that's untrue, if I said it, you wouldn't print it. But if he's the president of the United States, how do you not cover what he says? And since he was president, in a lot of interviews I would give about the political situation, I would routinely say, I think the president is a sociopath. It never actually made it into print. I would say it and it wouldn't make it into print because that would be irresponsible for somebody to print. And Scott Ferson said the president of the United States is a sociopath. But I would say it in large part because I knew it wouldn't actually then end up in print. That said, I do think the president is a sociopath. And he didn't have an answer for that. And now we've been through 4 years of this. And we've got all of these platforms where all this information is out there. Then you've got the dynamic with, I wouldn't just say Fox, I would talk about CNN. CNN, my God, Tuesday and Wednesday, they must have said 100,000 times that Donald Trump didn't give Joe Biden the courtesy of meeting him at the door. I get it. Okay, I get it. You told me that 50,000 times ago. It's now not news anymore, but it was a point they're making in this business that it's become, because Donald Trump is not wrong in that he has been big business for media platforms. He has been good for them in a way that Joe Biden is not going to be. So I'm skeptical because of that you're able to, that you're going to have the business interests want to be able to address it in some way. Because I think frankly, it's working for everybody. I will say this, that there has to be this larger conversation about what the boundaries are with respect to the ethical boundaries of, I had a reporter blog when Senator Kennedy died, something where he put me into a story about the Mormon temple because I represented the Mormon church and Mitt Romney and Ted Kennedy. And I called up the reporter and I said, this is not true. You could have called me. We talked, you have my phone number. And he said, oh, that was my blog. I don't get paid for my blog. So I wasn't a reporter. And I said, well, if I Google, it just comes up. It doesn't Google verified reporter, not reporter, verified reporter, not reporting. It's just all there. And there has to be some adjustment. There has to be some reckoning. This is part of it as well with media writ large about who is and who isn't. I'm happy to talk to a Boston Globe reporter, whether they agree with my client or not, because they have an ethical grounding in what they've learned, right? A blogger does not. And it has no obligation to have an ethical grounding in having a conversation with me. And this is dangerous. It's, no seatbelt time right now. And we've got to figure out what the new boundaries are going to be in this
but
new
Fox
new
News
world.
with a license has no requirement either to tell the facts.
No, there were none essentially.
And they have
now.
a license slip that they're given as entertainment.
It took an insurrection for Twitter to ban the president.
Yeah.
And that is a whole nother topic. So I think this is the moment of truth. Scott, it's been really wonderful to spend an evening with you. And I really look forward to, as I think most of the rest of us do, a repeat on other topics. So if any of you have any ideas for Scott for his next program, please send them to us to let us know what he should be talking about. Because as Scott told me at the beginning of the program, he loves to talk about all of this stuff. And that's why
Lucy will tell you I'll talk about this all day long.
Okay, so we've just covered the waterfront here and we've learned an enormous amount. So unmute yourselves, please. And let's give Scott a round of applause so that he can hear it.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So be well, everyone. And we've had some fantastic questions tonight and a fantastic program.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.